It was all the way back in 2021 when the Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier, rest in peace, and Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis were first announced. These mobile outings would expand the new compilation of Final Fantasy VII even further, and though The First Soldier would receive mixed reception due to the fact that it was a battle royale, people were quite keen on Ever Crisis, a game that would supposedly be another remake of Final Fantasy VII, but this time with turn-based battles, and a more traditional retelling of not just Final Fantasy VII Original, but the entire compilation, including The First Soldier, and for the first time ever, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. It was an overwhelmingly exciting prospect, and today, after being invited to the closed beta test, I can give you a pretty grounded idea of just how much it lives up to the hype. So you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because today we're diving into Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. First and foremost, the presentation on this game is absolutely stunning. I normally don't start with the game's music, but with Ever Crisis you need to start with the music. It's absolutely stellar. They could have easily just reused tracks from the original or remake, but these are brand new arrangements, and if I'm being entirely honest, I actually prefer some of the arrangements in this soundtrack over the ones featured in the main FF7 remake. No, seriously, they're that good. There's also something to be said about this game's incredible presentation, especially for a mobile game. The game takes place on these pre-rendered backgrounds, which are nice and lovingly done. While I think the shot composition isn't always as immaculate as the original games, it is incredibly nice to see these beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds, with a set of beautiful new chibi models that have the same spirit as the original game. You can't overstate really just how gorgeous this game looks, especially for a mobile game. Just like the original Final Fantasy VII though, when you go into battles, the game switches to a more high fidelity graphics mode, and this is where they do reuse Final Fantasy VII Remake assets. And to be honest, it looks great. There is one thing I want to note however, and that is that sometimes this game's shadows glitch out. They will do this weird flickering thing, and it's especially triggered whenever you're recording. But again, this is a closed beta test, so I hope that that's fixed in the final version. Now in terms of the game's battle system, it actually reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy XIII's, but much better. Just like FF13, you have a charging ATB meter. Typically, the stronger the attack, the more ATB gauges it requires. There's also a paradigm shift-like system, except it's way more streamlined. You simply have a defense mode and an attack mode, where in something like defense mode, you'll do more healing, take less damage, etc. You'll also do far less damage. Enemies will use tank buster attacks at you in order to force you into defensive mode. All the meanwhile, you'll be swapping frantically back to attack mode in order to do the most damage. It's a really fun, fast flow to combat, and one of the more enjoyable turn-based battle systems that I've seen in a while. The game does rather faithfully retell the story of Final Fantasy VII, however, one thing that is worth noting is that this is still a more abridged version of FF7. It could be because this is a closed beta, but it seems as though some things are going to be sped through a little bit faster than others. Ultimately, it feels more like a digest of the original Final Fantasy VII than a complete remake of it. One of the more minor criticisms I have of this game is that every time you finish a small section of the game, it then returns you to the chapter select screen. And I get why this is implemented, because this is a mobile game and it's meant for you to have these little bite-sized chunks of enjoyment of it. If you're on a train or a bus, it allows you to complete a small section of the game at a time. However, if you're looking to be fully immersed in this in the way that you'd be immersed in an actual Final Fantasy VII remake, it's going to be jarring to be pulled out of the story every few minutes. And also, while I think this game is an incredibly fun gacha, I think it is important to remember that this game is exactly that. It is a gacha, and I think if you're going into this game expecting some sort of alternate Final Fantasy VII remake, where they remade the game so that turn-based and story purists can be happy, this is totally not that. It is very much a gacha game that retells the story of FF7 and its compilation, and if you want to get strong in this game, while yes, you can grind and do such things, there will be difficulty spikes, in which case you will need to participate in the gacha elements, at least of this closed beta. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that the final game is going to require you to wail on it and spend a ton of money. That just means that you are going to have to pull stuff and deal with multiple gacha currencies, meaning that if you're looking for something that resembles the Final Fantasy VII gameplay flow, that is not here. There's also some artificial damage checkpoints in order to make sure that you're damage outputting enough. What I specifically mean by that is that battles are timed, meaning that if you take too long on a given battle, you get an automatic game over. So even if you have a strategy to, say, fight a boss underpowered, if that strategy takes you too long of a time, then you're still not able to clear it, creating a sense of pressure on the player to have the most optimal damage output. But simply, this is a gacha game. However, I must admit it is a really good one. I found myself reaching for my device to play a little bit more of it here and there all the time. I simply couldn't put it down. It really is a fun game. However, anyone going into this expecting it to be a Final Fantasy VII Remake, Purist Edition, it is definitely not that. It is an incredibly fun, incredibly well-built FF7 gacha, and it will allow you to experience many of the best moments from the FF7 series, as well as brand new things such as the story being added to the first soldier, or a version of Advent Children that you can actually play through. It also makes good use of the FMVs from the compilation, because a lot of those are used throughout the game, and it's really cool to have that classic Final Fantasy CG playing. It's worth noting also that the game doesn't actively have voice acting for most of its lines. There are voice lines that are used, however, it is strictly Japanese and no English option, at least not in this closed beta. It's interesting too, because most of these lines are just reused from the main games. So as for why they couldn't just reuse the English lines, I'm not really sure. But all that being said, I have no doubt that Ever Crisis is going to be a top tier gacha. Shout out to Skulch, Tugal, TCG, and the rest of the Ultima community.